My presentation will be also a comment on some aspects of my talk last night. But the trajectory would be different. In other words, I would like to say something about the relevance and implications of an approach to history based on case studies, using my own case as an approach. I'm not interested in intellectual autobiography, but I would like to understand the implications of something I did in the past from that point of view, from the point of view of cases put in a general perspective. So you will excuse, I hope, the autobiographical references, which do not imply a kind of transparency between myself today and what I was then. On the contrary, there is opaqueness, and I will go back to this. So let me start from a moment in my life. I was 20 in 1959. I was in the library of the Scuola Normale in Pisa, where I studied, and much later I taught for a few years. And suddenly I made 3 decisions. First of all, I thought that I would have tried to become a historian. Secondly, I would have liked to work on witchcraft. And thirdly, I would have liked to work not on the persecution of witchcraft, but I would have tried to rescue the voices of the people, men and women, accused of witchcraft. Now, I was completely unaware of the topic. And so I started to read the entry in the huge Enciclopedia Italiana, Stregoneria. And I tried to learn something. But so there was this discrepancy, which is in my view interesting, because the discrepancy between what I knew and what I didn't know, and the commitment. Now, later on, I thought that every important decision in life, not only in professional life, but in life, is in fact based on such kind of discrepancy. In other words, we make important decisions about our own life in the dark. Not a complete dark, but in the dark. Which is not, let's say, a homage to irrational forces. In other words, those irrational forces exist, but I'm, let's say, on the side of the Enlightenment, on the side of Freud, Freud's interpretation of the Enlightenment, trying to understand that those irrational forces exist, but we have to try to understand them. Anyway, this is a huge topic. We can go back to this, to the implications of it. So, that decision, those decisions. So I started to read books, and I remember that very early I read a little book, a little unpretentious book, published in that French series, Que sais-je, which is obviously a homage to Montaigne, and a kind of unpretentious introductions to basic topics. And so it was a book by Jean Palou on witchcraft, la sorcellerie. So I started reading this, and there were references to Michelet's La Sorcière, which afterwards I read, interpreting witchcraft in the footsteps of Michelet as something related to revolt. Witchcraft as an act of revolt. A very romantic idea, which is behind Michelet's powerful book, which is, and is not a book of actual historical book, even in its format. So I reacted to this, and I thought, yeah, this is what I would like to do, but let's say turning this into kind of different version, meaning witchcraft as a sort of a primitive form of class struggle. Why? Well, retrospectively, that's easy to understand. Belonging to my generation in Italy, I was under the impact of Antonio Gramsci's notebooks, letters from the jail and so on, and Gramsci had been a powerful influence. There is something to be added, however. Very early in my research, I came across an article published in Società, which was the ideological journal of the Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, by Eric Hobsbawm. And Hobsbawm wrote an article which, as far as I know, has never been translated, published in another language. It does not exist in English, as far as I know. It's called Per la storia delle classi subalterne, for the history of subaltern classes. Now, here there is a digression which I'd like to make. In his prison notebooks, Gramsci used the word classi subalterne. Now, much later, I started to ask myself, which are the implications of this expression? Because obviously he was trying to circumvent the censorship, the fascist censorship in jail. So he didn't use the word proletariato. But class subalterne was a much wider notion. I mean, it included peasants and the working class as well. And so much later, actually in 1988, when I first visited India, there was a conference in Calcutta, and I met Barun Dey, who was a member of that recent journal, at that time recent, Subaltern Studies, and that very, let's say, dignified Indian historian asked me, what's the exact meaning in Italian of classi subalterne? That was the early version of Subaltern Studies, before, the momentous meeting with Derrida and Derrida's translator, Spivak. So, the very label of the group, Subaltern Studies, was in fact taken from Gramsci, translated into English. So there was this question, which in fact, that expression, classi subalterne, played a big role in the international impact of Gramsci's thought. Because, I immediately understood that in India, at that time I was unaware, but even people in Italy, where the director of the Gramsci Institute was unaware of that impact of Gramsci in India. And so I understood that from an Indian perspective, Gramsci was extremely important because through that expression and in his reflection, peasants played a role which was very different from, let's say, the traditional role assigned to them in the Third International. And so I also understood something which should be checked, meaning that Gramsci's reflections on the Risorgimento were translated into an Indian perspective, meaning Garibaldi was Gandhi and Cavour was Nehru. Anyway, back to 1959, 1960. I was aware, of course, of my commitment to, let's say, to Gramsci and how Gramsci had an impact on my hypothesis. Witchcraft as a crude form of class struggle. I was absurdly unaware at that moment of something which played a big role in my choice, as I later discovered. Meaning the fact, that emerged many years later, maybe in the late 70s. I had a conversation with a friend, an art historian in Torino, and he said, well, of course, being a Jew, you are interested in witches and heretics. And I was flabbergasted. Not because, I rejected the connection. On the contrary, the connection was so evident that I was unable to understand how I repressed it for years and years. So that connection, the emotional identification with victims, which played such a role in my own research, until today, because of all my interest in, let's say, methodological problems, is in a way the result of that paradoxical choice, trying to rescue the voices of the victims from the archives of repression, from documents which have been shaped and actually constructed by the judges and the inquisitors. So, my concern for methodological problems is the result of that paradoxical choice, and maybe vice versa to a certain extent. But anyway, so there was this emotional commitment. I started to work on Inquisition archives in Modena, in northern Italy. For some reason, the Inquisition trials are in the state archives, so they were accessible to anyone. And then that was a chapter of my dissertation, and in fact, the first essay I ever published, which is an essay on which is called, I quote from the English translation, it's called Witchcraft and Popular Piety, Notes on a Modenese Trial of 1519. I found I came across a trial against a couple, peasants. They had been ejected by the land they were tilling, and so by the owner, the landowner, a lady. And so, according to the accusation, they had put a charm against the owner. And so, there was a trial. Now, the trial has also other aspects. First of all, I suspected, and my guess was in fact correct, that the judge, Bartolomeo da Pisa, was in fact a famous demonologist, Bartolomeo Spina, who published a treatise against witches, on witches, let's say. But anyway, this is one point. And then there is this, the questions asked to the witch, and or the alleged witch, and she said, Chiara Signorini, that suddenly, she said, yeah, I put the charms because I met the Virgin. The Virgin? This was the astonished question by the judge, the inquisitor, and she said, yes, the Virgin, and so there is the description of the Virgin. The Virgin said, yeah, you have to put the charms against the owner. And then there is the attempt of the inquisitor to convince the woman that the Virgin was in fact the devil. Anyway, I concluded that piece saying that documents of this kind may be able to shed light on the nature of the relationship which assumed dramatic form during the trial between witches and inquisitors, and thereby invite further study of these sources. There is another sentence which I'm going to read. As you may understand, I thought that my hypothesis about witchcraft as a crude form of class struggle was proven in that case by that case. In other words, it was evident to me, I was really disappointed. So, in a way, I still remember that feeling. Okay, the hypothesis was correct. So actually, at the end, I enlarged my comment. And I concluded saying, from this point of view, the relationship between witches and inquisitors, cases, such as that of Chiara Signorini, can have exemplary value, even in their most unique aspects. Now, the translation says, and it's a very good translation, can have exemplary value. In fact, what I had written was hanno un valore paradigmatico. So there was a reference to paradigms. To Kuhn's paradigms? No. The article was published in 1961. Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions was published in 1962. So I read it a few years later. I'm not claiming that I was, let's say, using the word paradigm in Kuhn's sense, of course. What I'm saying is that this notion of exemplum, of exemplary value, is in fact something which is still with us. The paper which I suggested for reading on slaves' latitude and the Bible has been reprinted in a collection of essays which is called Science Without Laws. And the subtitle reads Model Systems, Cases, Exemplary Narratives. And actually there is a reference to my essay, which is included in the collection. Just at the end of the introduction, the editors quoted again that marvelous sentence by Proust, which I put at the end of on my paper, saying, well, this sentence by Proust can be a description for our entire enterprise. So there is this notion of exemplum, a case as an exemplum, not in the sense of, let's say, being typical. It seems to me different. My idea of paradigmatico was not about typicality. In fact, what I later understood was that, in fact, it was an anomaly, but an anomaly which was at the same time revealing. Let me mention an anecdote. I hope that I didn't quote it in that piece, but I don't think so. I quoted it once. It's an anecdote which I heard from at a seminar in Pisa from that great philologist Gianfranco Contini, a great Romanist. And he said that there are two French philologists. Did you hear the story? Okay. There are two French philologists. One of them had a long beard, and he was fond of all kinds of anomalies, morphological anomalies, grammatical anomalies. And so when he found them, when he came across them, he caressed his beard and said, "C'est bizarre." Now, there was a second philologist, and the second philologist had a sort of lucid mind and also a lucid head. He was bald, and he was just the opposite. He loved to turn anomalies into, showing that actually they could be included in a rule. And so at that moment, when the rule emerged, he rubbed his hands and said, "C'est satisfaisant pour l'esprit." Now, I heard it's satisfying for the mind, for the intellect. So I remember that I heard that story, and I thought, well, I'm certainly on the side of the philologist with a long beard. Later, years later, I understood that that was not the case. I'm not interested in bizarre events or documents as such. There is something different. In other words, I'm interested in anomalies because anomalies, from an epistemological point of view, are more fruitful more rich than norms. Because a norm, or a document which is, let's say, can be regarded as identical with the norm, does not include the possible anomalies. On the contrary, every anomaly implies the norm. So anomalies are more rich. That would be my point. And so the point is to show how, let's say, the anomalies include the rule and violate the rule at the same time. Now, I was retrospectively struck by the fact that I used the word cases at the end of my first article. Because, well, certainly, I mean, a case is not a document. A case already implies, let's say, a series. And so a case which implies also a rule. I must say, at that time, I had no interest in casuistry at all. On the contrary, I had a kind of a moral resistance against casuistry. But I will come back to this in a moment. Okay, so there was this feeling of disappointment. My initial hypothesis has been proven in that case, and I was disappointed. And so I started to work on, I mean, to look for witchcraft trials, but without any hypothesis, in fact. Now, I don't remember whether what I'm going to say, which is something which I published in an essay, is also part of that collection of essays which has been translated into Hungarian. If I'm going to say something which you are already familiar with, please stop me immediately. It's about my first encounter with, well, I was in Venice. I was in Venice in the State Archive in Venice, where there is a huge series of, archival series of witchcraft trials. And I had no clue about what I was looking for. So I went there. That was, I think, in 1963. I went there, and I was allowed to ask for 4 pieces, archival pieces. So I said from that archival fund. So I went there and said 6, 34, 85, 91. Randomly. Well, randomly, not exactly. There is a handwritten inventory with vague descriptions of the content of each piece, saying witchcraft, for instance. So, okay, but very vague. So, I mean, later on I said it was a kind of a Venetian roulette. So I went there, and at a moment, I came across a trial. Actually, it's not exactly a trial, it's a question. A series of questions asked by the inquisitor to a peasant. 1584. And the question was, why do you, the name of the young man was Menichino dalla Tisana. Why you, Menichino, call yourself Benandante? A word I've never heard before. Benandante, somebody who goes for the good. And the young man said, because 4 times a year, like other Benandanti, we leave our body and we go in spirit to fight for the fertility of the crops with the witches. We have as a weapon fennel branches, and the witches have sorghum sticks, and we fight for the fertility of the crops in the meadow of Josaphat, and so on and so on. So I remember that I read this 4 handwritten pages, and I became so excited that I had to leave the archive, and I started to, at that time I was still smoking, so I was started to smoke cigarettes along the Chiesa dei Frari, that fantastic place where you have two of the most beautiful paintings by Titian, splendid polyptych by Giovanni Bellini, and so on. So I was walking and I thought, I found something extraordinary. Now, retrospectively, this is why I wrote something on this. Retrospectively, I tried to understand my reaction. Because at that moment I thought, okay, I found something which is incredibly rich. I didn't know at that moment, which I would have been able to find 50 trials against those people in Udine, not in Venice, some of them very long, which are in fact the basis of my first book, I Benandanti. Now, why did I insist on those trivial details? Because this random search is, in my view, important. I tried to reflect later on this, and this is part of what I described last night as well. Now, this may seem frivolous, but in my view, it's not. What does it mean to, let's say, give space to a random search? First of all, it seems to me, it implies that our hypotheses are by definition less rich than reality, documentary reality, reality as such. Secondly, our biases, our hypotheses, which includes our biases as well, are shaped by our biases, can be controlled, but tend to be confirmed. Not always, but let's say there is a either conscious or unconscious, usually both, attempt to arrange the evidence in order to confirm our hypothesis. So I think what's important is to be taken by surprise. And that's the purpose of the random choice. To be taken by surprise even for a moment, for 2 seconds. Actually, this is what happened with my Piero case. May I have one more digression? What time is it?
Yes, you can.
I can. Okay. I wrote a little piece, which is also available in English in a shorter version, but it's already very short, which is called Conversations with Orion. Orion is the name of the software on which the online catalog of UCLA library has been constructed. And so I tried to describe how it's possible to use catalogs in a sort of devious way. Actually, I started this game with card catalogs, but I mean with online catalogs is certainly much faster and easier. So the idea is to use catalogs not only in order to find something which we are looking for, but also in order to find something which we don't know that it exists. So, for instance, I remember that I spent 2 hours in my life asking Orion, that was one of the conversations, asking Orion social history as a title, as a keyword. Of course, I mean, books at UCLA are only a fragment of all published books. And what I can find is only titles. Then there is the content, but it's already a clue. And so I had something in mind about social history, and I asked that question. Anyway, how did I find Piero? In the following way. I was working on Auerbach and Voltaire. Maybe this is an essay which has been included in that Hungarian collection, I don't remember. Anyway, I published it. The idea was to, I mean, Auerbach's book, Mimesis, has been one of the books which really shaped my intellectual life, and in many, many ways. And so I decided to write a piece on Auerbach's, starting from Auerbach's chapter or comment on Voltaire's passage on the London Stock Exchange. And then I tried to put both Voltaire in perspective and Auerbach in perspective. So the title is Auerbach Reads Voltaire. There is this double perspective. I use the word perspective, which is actually the word used by Auerbach himself in order to describe his own method. Anyway, I was working on this and then I thought, well, but maybe it would be possible to make a sort of a systematic experiment with Orion, taking the first paragraph of Voltaire's Traité de Métaphysique, a splendid posthumous work, and checking each word in Orion. Now, it was really a crazy idea because after all, I mean, we know about, let's say, Voltaire's library, Voltaire's readers, so it was not the best possible case. But anyway, I started. So I said, okay, let's start from a proper name. It will be quicker. Kafra, because there is the story is about a person from the outer world which comes to Earth. So it starts in the Pays de Kafra. So Kafra, it started Kafra. No answer in Orion, from Orion. No, that was Kafreri maybe. And so I asked Kafra as an alternative. 7 items emerged. I looked at the item which was the earliest in date, Puree's piece. Never heard of Puree. By chance, the book was not in the rare book collection because there was a photocopy which was in the open shelves. So I immediately checked and I started leafing it. And I thought, Weber. Now, this is a counter-argument against me, of course, because ultimately I suggested that Weber was relevant. I mean, at that moment, I was completely unaware of Puree's existence. And actually, I spent some time looking for Puree in French dictionaries. Only later I understood that he was from Neuchâtel, a Swiss. But the fact that I thought about Weber, but why? Because I thought, okay, well, there is somebody making a project about colonizing the world in the early 18th century. Or there are all those quotations from the Bible, from the Old Testament. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a Catholic, probably a Protestant Weber. Now, it's an argument against myself because first I was taken by surprise, but then I immediately started with an hypothesis, which actually I tried to work out. But again, it seems to be, to me, important to give space to this kind of serendipity. Now, the usual word is serendipity. In 1979, I published a piece, which is also available in Hungarian, on clues, in which actually I found the explanation for this word, serendipity, which was introduced by Walpole in the 18th century. But it was based, in fact, on a tale published in Venice in 1555, I think. La storia dei figli di Serendippo. And it's about 3 kids from, actually not the figli, but it's from Serendippo, meaning Sri Lanka today. So it's a oriental tale. And those people see the traces of an animal, the footprints, and they are able to describe the animal, Zadig, Voltaire's Zadig, La méthode de Zadig, as it has been called later. I mean, it comes from the Orient, as they say. But I mean, it's, there is this transmission, and there is this story, and there is serendipity. Now, I tried to make a reflection on cases. But only later I started to reflect on casuistry, meaning the meta level, the intellectual tradition focusing on cases and anomalies. I said I had a resistance against this. I had no religious background, no religious education, except something I heard at school, I mean, attending classes. So some information about Catholic religion, but I must say, in my family, there was a, I would say, in quotation marks, a emphasis on a Pascalian attitude, not something related to casuistry. In other words, the centrality of moral law, not the idea of, let's say, circumventing, let's say, the law through anomalies. So there was this resistance in my mind. But then when I wrote that piece on clues, in a way I was already working on cases, reflecting on cases. Giovanni Morelli, the Italian art historian who invented that method, which aimed to trace a distinction, to identify originals from copies, old masters' originals from copies, saying we have to focus not on central details like, let's say, the smile in the Leonardo school, but on minor details, earlobes, nails. Well, Morelli has, let's say, illustrations in his essays with Botticelli's nails, Botticini's nails, and so on and so forth. So, series. But even if I was thinking about anomalies, the meta level, the reflection on casuistry was still something which I did not face. This came in sort of unpredictable way after September 11. I was teaching at UCLA, not at that moment, I was in Europe, but then as a topic for my seminar the year after, I thought, okay, my graduate seminar, it would be Machiavelli. I'd never worked on Machiavelli. I heard a seminar on Machiavelli, I read Machiavelli, but I heard a seminar on Machiavelli at the very beginning of my student years. And I thought, okay, that's the moment. Let's have a seminar on Machiavelli. Machiavelli and religion, you know, Machiavelli. Okay. So we started reading The Prince, but I started to build up hypotheses about my seminar. And I thought, casuistry. Now this is a case of unconscious memory, as I realized later on, because Benedetto Croce, the Italian philosopher and historian who had a powerful hegemony on the Italian intellectual life in the first half of the 20th century. Benedetto Croce wrote an essay on Machiavelli. I was unaware of the context of the essay when I read it for the first time, but maybe I will say something later. But he published this essay in 1925, and it's called Elementi di Politica, sort of a primary introduction to politics. There's a chapter on Machiavelli, very dense, rejecting the connection between Machiavelli's moral commitment and casuistry, counter-reformation casuistry. But then there was a follower of Croce, Luigi Russo, who wrote a book on Machiavelli, and actually claimed that in Machiavelli's La Mandragola, that kind of black play, in which there is a scene in which a friar tries to convince a virtuous lady that adultery is not a sin. And Rousseau said, this is an example of, this friar is a forerunner of casuistry. Now, I had read a book by Rousseau. Actually, he collected his essays after the war, and there is a dedication also to my father, who had died in 1944. I'd forgotten about, let's say, this connection, possible connection between Machiavelli and casuistry, but it re-emerged unconsciously, and I decided, okay, maybe casuistry can be a context. So I started to have a conversation with Orion on this. I came across a book by a Jesuit on San Bernardino da Siena, and the Jesuit quoted a passage by San Bernardino, the Franciscan friar who became a saint at the end in mid-15th century. And so there are sermons by him, sermons against a lot of different people, including Jews. And so there is a sermon in which there is a reference to a legal writer quoted by another legal writer. And I remember that I read this footnote and I thought, but I'm familiar with this name. Why? Because we have a libro di ricordi, a book of recollections, as they were recollections. It was a kind of logbook used in Florentine families. And by chance, one of those books survived by Machiavelli's father. Now, this has been published. I mean, for a long time, not really used except for a few references, meaning my son Niccolò started to go to school and so on. So only reference to Niccolò. But in order to prepare myself to the seminar, I read that logbook and I noted references to books bought by Machiavelli's father, including a book by Giovanni d'Andrea, that legal writer whose name re-emerged in San Bernardino's sermon. Giovanni d'Andrea. The reference used by Bernardino was to the possibility of circumventing usury, using an argument based on evil and lesser evil. The same argument used by the friar who tried to convince that lady that adultery is not a sin. So casuistry used not against usury, as in the case of Giovanni d'Andrea, but about adultery. But so, and this was the topic of the article which I published, so we have a book in Machiavelli's father's library, Giovanni d'Andrea, which I checked, with a long passage which has been literally reused by Machiavelli in his La Mandragola. And actually, what I argued is that the most famous section in The Prince, in which you have a series of virtues of the prince listed by Machiavelli, and I think 4 times, in 4 different chapters in sequence, Machiavelli say, okay, a prince should be virtuous, non di manco, but it's very strong, non di manco. So it's the anomaly, the exception against the rule. A prince should be generous, non di manco, and so on and so forth. So my argument was, here we have something which is really at the very core of Machiavelli's approach. You may see how serendipity, so-called, played a role in this. But also, let's say, unconscious memories, biases, and so on and so forth. What I found, in my view, is not only something which is as solid as a rock, as an argument, but also something which was, let's say, beyond imagination, because everybody's, let's say, looking at Machiavelli as a Renaissance man. I mean, we could discuss about Renaissance as a category. But anyway, so forgetting that he was able and actually read in his father's library a typical medieval book. This man, Giovanni d'Andrea, died in 1348. This is the Middle Ages, so-called. But who cares about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance? Except for, well, as historical constructions, used by actors. There is an essay, splendid essay by Gombrich, never collected by Gombrich, because it's a sort of, let's say, addressed to school teachers, splendid essay. The Renaissance as a category and as a movement, I think this is the title. So, cases, again, casuistry. At the moment I'm working again on casuistry, but on, let's say, Pascal's, the context of Pascal's Provincial, but that's something else. So I'm deeply interested in casuistry. There has been a revival of casuistry, of course, through bioethics. So that's for sure. In other words, yeah, I probably should stop, because otherwise it would be impossible to have a discussion.
Why don't you finish this sentence with bioethics?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Bioethics. There is a passage by Clifford Geertz in which he talks about maybe not casuistry as such, but that's the content, and about let's say the impact of bioethics. And he said, okay, we are confronted with let's say 2 cases, or let's say we are confronted with an extremely expensive engine, and so we have to make a choice about patients. So there is a patient, and here it tries to construct, I mean, it constructs a sort of politically incorrect case. We have a native Indian who is an alcoholic, and so on and so forth. So, should one invest money in this case or in another case? So, the singularity of cases becomes crucial in bioethics. That was the end of the sentence.
Thank you. I don't know whether we are in a much better position
or in a worse position
yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I hope that at least I clarified my emphasis on serendipity, which is not frivolous autobiography, I hope. I mean, I'm really committed to this. And actually, I always try to teach students the truthfulness of this game with catalogs. Asking vague questions to catalog in order to discover something which is completely unknown to us.